Hi, I'm Monica. And I guess I'll be talking to you today about regularization as well. But we're going to be talking about word order in verb phrases and noun phrases. And we're going to be talking about it from the perspective of a silent gesture paradigm. So we all know not all word orders are created equal. Subjects, objects, and verbs can appear in any order, but cross-linguistically, most of the world's languages tend to be either SOV or SVO. And this is also true for the orderings of nouns and adjectives. In principle, they could go either way, but most of the world's languages, actually roughly 2/3, end up with the noun adjective as opposed to the adjective noun order. So what are the factors contributing to this typological preferences that we see? Well, the full answer is still out there, but one important factor that's been identified is a natural bias towards some word orders over others. And what I mean by natural bias is simply that some orders appear to be a bit more cognitively preferred. So in the verb phrase, for example, the natural order appears to be SOV order. And evidence for this comes from emerging languages like Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language and Nicaraguan Sign Language. But complementing this has also been a particularly influential line of studies using the silent gesture paradigm. So in these studies, folks are asked to describe some events using only gestures, no words, no props. And they've shown that people overwhelmingly prefer the SOV order, even though these are speakers of SVO languages. And in the noun phrase, we're starting to see the same picture. There's growing evidence that there's a natural bias towards the noun adjective order. Some of this evidence comes from Nicaraguan Sign Language, and in the lab, very recent studies using the silent gesture paradigm, again, have shown noun adjective preferences even among speakers of adjective noun languages. More recently, though, other studies have argued that while this cognitive or this natural bias can be a very powerful factor, it alone probably doesn't explain the whole picture that we see out there. So one of these pressures that might also interact is something very known to the language learning literature. It's the pressure to regularize variable input. So thankfully, Kate has already walked you through most of the field there. But in principle, when a language learner, for example, is faced with unpredictable input like this, one possibility is simply to proportion match, to simply output the variance in the same exact proportions that they received them. But it turns out kids, especially learners, don't really do this. Instead, what they do is they tend to select a variant to overproduce at greater frequency relative to the input. So rather than proportion match, they'll overproduce and do something like this. And perhaps unlikely in this example, but you can also imagine regularization of the minority order, so something like this, where they overproduce the minority input. And this is in contrast to something like this, where there's certainly overproduction of a minority order, but regularization in terms of reduction of variability is not here. So the question that we are after today is how might the interaction between people's natural word order biases and the pressure to regularize contribute to the typological patterns that we see in the world's languages? And so far it appears that that answer can be somewhat complex, even when folks use the same paradigm. So for example, on the one hand, very recent work by Motamedi et al. Looked at this question in the context of natural biases within the verb phrase. They did a silent gesture regularization study where they showed participants simple line drawings like this, and then they trained them on videos of someone describing that event using only gesture. And this is an artificial gesture language that they created. Of course, importantly, the order of the gestures that was varied so that participants saw 70% natural and 30% unnatural orders. So that's that top one there, or they received the opposite proportion. In a test, folks saw the drawings again and then picked the order that they remembered from training. It was disguised as a memory test. And they found regularization when the majority order was natural, but not when the majority of the input was unnatural. So more recently, Annie Holtz and colleagues extended this same paradigm to natural orders in the domain of the noun phrase. She gave that talk Thursday morning, and unlike Yasmin's study, she found that natural biases within the noun phrase disappeared in the context of regularization. So as you can see, the results seem to be a little bit complex and point to different pictures. But it's also hard to say what's actually going on because even though they use the same general paradigm, there were nonetheless quite a few differences between the two sets of studies, including, for instance, stimuli, gesture, even the number of biases simultaneously tested. So what we want to do here is, given that the interaction between people's natural biases and the pressure to regularize seem very much an open question, the aim of this work is to see how these two factors interact across two domains. That's the domain of the noun phrase and the verb phrase. We're going to use the exact same method and stimuli for these two studies. So we did a regularization study in the same exact way as the studies I've just showed you. First, we gathered a bunch of native English speakers with no prior exposure to sign language. And then we put these participants through a training phase where they were shown some events and then trained on some gesture descriptions. And in our study, instead of having line drawings, participants saw 12 real-world videos that looked like this. And then these were followed by a silent gesture training vignette that showed the natural noun adjective or unnatural adjective noun order. And here you're going to see a video producing the noun adjective order. So you're going to see paintbrush, and then small, and then the rolling between your hands. Okay. Of course, we varied the frequency of the natural versus unnatural orders by condition. So in this top condition, they're going to get the natural, that's the noun adjective order, 75% of the time, and then the unnatural, that's the adjective noun order, only 25% of the time. But in this second condition, you'll see the frequencies are reversed. 25% natural, 75% unnatural. And you'll notice that the verb is last here in both of these conditions. For the sake of counterbalancing, we also included these two other conditions where the verb is first. It ends up not mattering. So during test, we then gave them a forced choice comprehension task where they watched the event video again, and then they saw something like this. And they were told to select between the two videos describing that gesture. So if you haven't figured it out yet, don't feel bad. It's actually really, really challenging. You actually have, what we actually have here is the natural noun adjective order on one side and the unnatural on the other. They did a total of 16 test trials composed of the 12 original training items and 4 trials for a previously unseen, from a previously unseen event. It's pretty hard. Okay, so let's take a look at our results. To start, let's look at the proportion of natural order selections that people made in each condition. And that's what I've got on the y-axis here. And on the bottom x-axis, I've listed the 4 conditions with the majority order, so the one that folks see 75% of the time listed first in every case. And these green dotted lines are just to remind you what proportion of the natural order they saw in that condition. So if people are proportion matching, we expect folks to basically fall pretty exactly along that dotted line in each condition. And if they're over-selecting the natural order, we expect them to be above that input line. By the same logic, if they're under-selecting the natural order, we expect them to fall below that input line. So this is the general pattern that we found, and I want you to note the location of the group means, which is those thick horizontal bars relative to the input line. But to get a better picture, this is what the data looks like when I superimpose individual participants, which are each represented by a dot on top of those box plots. Okay. And what's important to note is not only those group means, but also where our participants cluster relative to the input line. So when the majority of the input is the natural order, which is this first purple condition, our participants are bunched up at the top, basically all over selecting that natural order. But what's especially impressive is what's going on here when the majority of the input is unnatural. So that's our yellow condition. And here, our group means and our biggest clusters of our participants fall way above that input line, meaning the participants in that condition are not just going with the order that they saw most frequently, they're actually going with the natural order, even though they saw it only at 25% of the time. And as I mentioned earlier, although the tendency to overselect the natural order does appear weaker in the verb first conditions, the bulk of our folks are actually bunched up also at the top. So across the board, we see that in all of our conditions, people are over-selecting the natural order. Oops, I think I'm off. Okay, here we go. And in fact, we can do a more direct thing when we look at regularization by looking at something called entropy change, which Kate has also nicely described already. So the way that we did this is we wanted to test the amount of variation that people produced at test relative to what the amount of variation that they received in training. And what we're going to see is when we do this, people are regularizing their input only in the conditions when the majority of the input was that natural order. So in this purple condition, for instance, where the majority of the input was natural, we see a negative entropy change score and no overlap with the zero line, meaning that the variation at test was significantly less than the variation at training. In other words, there was more regularity. So our participants were, in fact, choosing to regularize their input, making it less variable, and doing that by selecting the natural order. By contrast, the majority unnatural conditions, that's the yellow ones, there's no significant reduction in the amount of variation between training and test, which is not totally surprising because we had a lot of regularizers, but also that cluster in the middle meant we had a lot of variation increasers. Okay, and if you were concerned about that third condition looking somewhat proportion matchy, be assured that it actually wasn't. Okay, how does this look when we move to the verb phrase? Well, we did the same exact study with 160 new people, and we had these conditions instead. Again, for the sake of counterbalancing, we also played with the position of the adjective, but that also doesn't matter. Okay, and what did we find? I'm going to show you the results of the noun phrase on the left. These are not new at all, you just saw them. But the new stuff is going to be on the right, okay, and it's going to be on the right side. So let's focus on the majority natural conditions, which for the noun phrase were the purple ones you already saw, and for the verb phrase are these blue conditions. So in these conditions, we generally find the same pattern of results. In particular, there's big clusters of people that are over-selecting the natural order in both cases. But in the majority unnatural conditions, though, things start to look a little bit different. In the noun phrase, we saw that people were over-selecting the majority natural order. They were being above the input line. But in the case of the red bars, what we're seeing is that they're below that input line for the natural order, meaning that while folks in the noun phrase were always overproducing that natural order, folks in the verb phrase were always overproducing the majority order, whatever that order might be. And we get the same picture when we compare the entropy change scores. Again, we see that the difference between the noun phrase and the verb phrase is not in these natural conditions. We see regularization for the purple and the blue bars. But in the unnatural conditions, this is where we again see the difference. Whereas we found no evidence of regularization in the noun phrase for the majority unnatural conditions, we do find evidence of regularization in the unnatural conditions for the verb phrase. So they're regularizing across the board for the verb. So the question is, why do people over-select and regularize towards the unnatural order in the verb phrase, but not the unnatural order in the noun phrase? Well, given the typological facts, in particular the fact that object-verb and verb-objects order appear roughly equally, but noun-adjective outnumbers adjective-noun 2 to 1, one reasonable possibility to consider is that the natural bias affecting verb phrases may be more flexible than the natural bias affecting noun phrases. And there are a couple of ways that we can imagine this happening. So one way, this graphic always gets messed up. One way is to simply imagine that the baseline strength of the natural bias is stronger in the domain of the noun phrase than it is in the verb phrase. And so under this account, people don't regularize in the unnatural adjective-noun condition because that natural bias sort of outweighs that concern. In the verb phrase, where the natural bias is weaker, they are incentivized to regularize towards the unnatural verb-object order, though, because it's when it's the most frequent. Complicating this account, though, is the fact that Motomedia et al. Found regularization also in the verb phrase only in the majority when the majority of the input is natural, meaning that they found no difference between patterns of regularization in the verb versus noun phrase. A second complication is that we don't find evidence of this from any sort of spontaneous silent gesture production studies. So another way to imagine the relative flexibility of the cognitive bias, or the natural bias, might be in terms of competing pressures. So in this case, the baseline strength of the natural bias is the same in both domains, but something else tips the scales in the case of verb phrases that's not in noun phrases. In our work, we think that this competing factor came from the salience of the action in our event videos, which didn't happen in Motabini's work, which looked at line studies. So in this case, videos promoted the salience of the action and put it front and center. So when people were describing them using gestures, they picked an order that allowed them to simply put the most salient thing first. And in our study, I want to point out that verb salience, or the salience of the action, is what we think happened. But in principle, anything could tip the scales in the process of production or language learning towards a regularization in that unnatural verb-object condition. And this way of looking at it accounts for the differences both between our noun phrase and the verb phrase, and as well for the patterns that we see in our data versus in Motamedi's data. So of course, all of this is ongoing, but we are doing a lot of rigorous testing to see if in fact this way of looking at this is the right way to do it. We'd like to do that with Bayesian modeling. And of course, we want to see if comprehension and production processes are affected the same way in regularization, given that these processes don't necessarily need to align. Okay, and with that, I will thank our collaborators, and I will see if questions are happening.
Thanks. We have a few minutes for questions. Do we have any from the room?
Hey, very interesting data. I was wondering also in the light of what came up during one of the symposia yesterday, your participants, were they mainly English speakers?
So we recruit them online, and as far as we can tell, they're self-reported native speakers of English. That was part of our screening.
Yeah, so what do you expect your results to be different if you have people with other native languages that have different word orders?
So one thing about the silent gesture paradigm is that it's really good at capturing these biases that are communicative but not necessarily conditioned by your language background. So the reason why that's sort of the reason why we picked this as the artificial language. So in the silent gesture studies that we've done with that my collaborators have done with subject object verb order, that order appears for English speakers who are SVO, Mandarin speakers, Turkish speakers, Spanish speakers. Those are all not SVO, but so independent. It seems like what I mean by that natural bias is that cognitive bias that happens in communication without the imposition of the grammatical structure. And so I think the idea here is we're using that gesture paradigm. And so I don't think necessarily that a native speaker of a different language should necessarily show a different set of results.
It's a great talk, and I love this paradigm. I was a methodological question. You loop the videos on the test trials, so regardless of what you always see verb, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase. Could that explain why people show less of a preference?
So they also saw noun phrase verb in two other conditions. I don't know that the loop, as far as I know, the looping shouldn't necessarily have an effect and we can't not loop the videos just because then people don't have time to see everything. But let's see. I think that if the looping it causes things to be more verb first, you would have also perhaps seen that in the two conditions where we had the verb last. But I guess we didn't contrast the verb order. So sorry, this is a little bit complicated. So because I'm trying to get the diagram out.
I was trying to write it out and see what the sequence looked like.
Yeah. So it shouldn't necessarily matter in the noun phrase because you're never contrasting order of the verb, and so we don't find any effects there. In the verb phrase, you might, yes, in the verb phrase, because we played with the position of the verb, looping it might move things. Yeah, I think that that's possible. But then you might expect sort of the opposite pattern. You wouldn't expect that to count for cases where the majority of the input was verb last.
Yeah.
Um,
Or it might push
or
them
verb-
50-50 everywhere.
yeah, maybe. They shouldn't go towards that majority order nearly as much.
Thank you.